All right, happy birthday, Nick. How you doing? It took me a little while to figure out exactly what I was going to review, and as it turns out, I have very strong feelings about the numerous entries in the Final Fantasy series and Square Enix Japanese RPGs. So, I'm not going to review all of them, despite the fact that I have played all of them. Uh, I am instead going to limit it to the selection that I still own physical copies of, which would be Final Fantasy IV, which this will be controversial, but I consider it the best 2D version in the series, unless you consider Chrono Trigger within the universe, which you shouldn't. It's not a Final Fantasy game, but this is undoubtedly the ultimate two-dimensional RPG, which we'll come to in a minute. Final Fantasy X and X Part 2, Final Fantasy XIII Parts 1, 2, and 3, and Final Fantasy 15. So, we're going to launch right into this. The Final Fantasy IV story is, quite frankly, one of the best that was ever told in the two-dimensional era for Final Fantasy games. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say Final Fantasy VI takes the cake, but 4 has more lovable characters, a more easily digestible storyline, and is not completely linear, but is linear enough that you don't feel lost if you don't have the easy direction. Final Fantasy VI was a bit too open world for the type of game they were trying to make, and it was very easy in the second half to have no idea what you were supposed to be doing. As two-dimensional games go, and I do think you have to rate the 2D and 3D separately, but as two-dimensional games go for the Japanese RPG series, this is probably an 8 out of 10. There's definitely a little bit of room for improvement here, which Chrono Trigger hits hardcore, but again, not a Final Fantasy game. This is my 10 out of 10 benchmark. I may do a separate video at some point about just Chrono Trigger, but Final Fantasy IV in the FF series is the best in the two-dimensional era. Final Fantasy X and X Part 2 is really interesting. So, 10, this is the first time in the Final Fantasy universe that a true sequel ever occurred. Previously, every entry in the series prior to that was a standalone game. There were certain facets that carried over from game to game. So all of them had chocobos, and all of them had characters with similar names. Well, I shouldn't say similar names. They all have a Sid, for example, and there are certain things that just carry over, even if they're not the same character. They're callbacks to the other versions. But this is a true sequel. So that was controversial in the first place. But the second reason that the X2 sequel was controversial was that it was an entirely female protagonist game, and the class system in it involved what a lot of people referred to as Final Fantasy Pretty Dress Up Edition. They had what they called dress spheres. So anytime you changed class from, say, fighter to cleric to whatever else, the characters would change clothes. I actually thought it was fantastic. A lot of people hated it because they couldn't get to enjoy the game because they couldn't get past that. In the 3D realm, I'd put this game around a 7. The story is very cool. I'm not going to spoil it for anybody here, even though it's 20 years old at this point. But there are marred by some similar flaws throughout all of the series. They have very repetitive enemies, even as you scale in power. And the game is rather linear. It does open up eventually, but it's fairly closed world. And if linearity is a problem, Final Fantasy XIII is not a game for you. I am among a limited set of Final Fantasy fans that actually greatly enjoys Final Fantasy XIII, but these games are Final Fantasy on rails. It is purely a beautiful story delivery mechanism. Now, the biggest flaw with that is that the story itself is a little convoluted, but nonetheless, I had a lot of fun with it. Interestingly enough, I think these games, there's not a lot of continuity between the three. They made Final Fantasy XIII, which is a single story. 13.2 revisits the same characters and introduces a weird time travel mechanic. It honestly felt like they didn't really know what they were doing, but tried to make it anyway. And 13.3 takes all the fun elements of 10-2 that everyone hated, the dress-up bits, except there's only one character playing all of the roles. You just get to play with lightning, which is a rare thing for a JRPG. Most JRPGs are going to be teams of between 3 and 6 controllable characters, but here you just get the one. And they take sort of a nod back at the time control element in 2, to where this entire game takes place in a repeatable 24-hour period. People who loved the game Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask for the N64 would be big fans of this. Well, could be big fans of this. If you like time control mechanics, it's a fun one. For me personally, and Maggie, cat for, cat tax, 10 was, listen, probably a 7. I think 10-2 was better. I'd put that at about a 7.5. It's still not as good as a 3D game as FF4 was of a 2D game. But 13 is probably a 6. 13-2 for me was about a 5. And 13 Lightning Returns, I actually rate up probably around, again, 7.5. Then you've got Final Fantasy 15. This was a technological marvel, quite frankly, for the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. If you consume it after watching this movie, which is called Kingsglaive, it came with the special edition. It's 2.5 hours, I think 2.5, might only be 2, of story that precede the opening to this game. With this game is a 9.5. It is a masterwork, open world, beautiful. The thing is fantastic. But if you don't have this story makes no goddamn sense. And it immediately drops to about a 6, because no matter how good the gameplay is, it would be completely marred by the abysmal story. And the first hour to 2 hours of gameplay here are intentionally very, very slow. And if you don't have this, that slowness will not make sense, and it will drive you away so hardcore it's not even funny. So, should you ever find yourself in a position to think, I want to play FF15, I don't care if you find it on YouTube or if you have the disc, you gotta watch Kingsglaive first, or you're gonna have a bad time. Everybody who I've told this to, who has told me they hate FF15, has gone and watched this and then told me that FF15 was one of their favorite games. So, must be viewed in combination, but if done so, this is a near masterpiece level game, assuming you like JRPGs in general. So, that's a lengthy combo review for you, but there you go, man. Happy birthday. And you can quite tell I'm not as practiced at this, but I hope you got something out of it. Enjoy.